There are cases that seem simple at first glance, but hide secrets so deep that they completely change everything you thought you knew. Today I will tell you about an elderly man found without injuries, with no signs of an accident, where a small detail in his clothing revealed a truth that no one expected. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it reached. My name is Mauricio Cardenas. I'm 38 years old and I work as a forensic doctor in Medellin, Colombia. Throughout my career, I've seen all kinds of scenes, some shocking, others tragic, and some simply puzzling. But nothing prepared me for the day an older man was found in his home, apparently dead from natural causes, without a single mark on his body. At first glance, everything seemed clear, a natural death, perhaps a heart attack or cardiac arrest. But forensic science has always taught me that bodies and their belongings tell stories, often more revealing than words or testimonies. When we arrived at the scene, the calmness of the house almost contrasted with the gravity of the finding. The scene showed no signs of a struggle, no disorder, no indications of violence. We carried out our usual tests, but it was obvious something didn't fit here. While examining the body in the room, something caught my attention. The way the victim was dressed, a detail barely visible to any untrained eye. I knew that this could change everything. So we began to look more closely, to analyze every part of the clothing, every thread, every seemingly insignificant thing. What we discovered was an unexpected twist that unleashed an investigation much more complex than I had ever imagined. But it wasn't just a finding itself. It was a lesson it left me. In forensic medicine, patience and attention to detail are the most powerful tools, because the body never lies, and its objects always have something to tell. Now, join me as I recount how a simple detail in that man's clothing completely changed the course of this case. When I arrived at the scene, the first thing that caught my attention was the apparent normality of the environment. A modest living room, well lit by the soft morning light, filtering through the curtains. There were no signs of fight, no objects out of place, nothing indicating that anything violent had occurred. The elderly man's body was lying on the sofa, in an almost natural position, as if he had simply fallen asleep. There were no bruises, no open wounds, no signs of trauma that would justify a quick ruling. But it was evident that his time had come. That lack of apparent signs is precisely what tests our patience and skills. What truly changed the course of this case was a small object on his clothing, something many would overlook because it seemed insignificant at first glance. A loose, poorly sewn button on the lapel of his coat. It was no ordinary button. It had a particular texture, old, worn, but with something written in barely visible ink. When I carefully cleaned it, I noticed it was a number, a code, that made me pause because of my years of experience. I had learned that the details that seem the shyest are often the ones that speak the loudest. I began to investigate a little more, first examining the clothing carefully, searching for any other clues hidden in the fabric, tags, marks, thread cracks that could tell a story. Gradually, the narrative started to take shape. I discovered that this man, although seemingly alone and calm, was in the midst of something much more complex. I found other objects with similar inscriptions, discreet but explicit to someone who knew where to look. His wife's hair tie, a handkerchief with hidden embroidery, an old book with handwritten notes in the margins. All these pieces formed a puzzle far beyond a simple natural death. I then decided to interview those close to him, his neighbors, friends, even his daughter, in an attempt to understand the context. What seemed to be an elderly man without problems ended up revealing a web of secrets, memories, and a network of complicated relationships. His health, initially considered stable, began to show signs of neglect, or perhaps something more intentional. But the most intriguing part was how that small button and the clues hidden in his belongings started to weave a thread between the past and the present, between death and the need for justice. At that moment, I knew this was not going to be an ordinary autopsy. I had to look beyond the body, understand the encrypted messages in his personal objects. Forensic science doesn't just analyze bodies. It also deciphers hidden stories. Yet, with every step I took, I felt the tension rise. There was something at stake that no one had considered. Every finding forced me to rethink the initial hypothesis, which slowly crumbled to make way for a much harsher reality, difficult to accept. For example, That button led me to discover a connection with a group of people who, unknowingly, had a relationship with the deceased far beyond familial or neighborhood affection. They were not visible enemies, not even acquaintances in the conventional sense. It was a hidden bond, woven through years of silences and omissions. The combination of those small details revealed to me that we were dealing with a case in which natural death could not be the immediate conclusion. There were clues hinting at intentions, and although there were no blows on the body, the true harm might have been invisible to the naked eye. As I continued with the autopsy, the body didn't provide clear answers at first. However, attention to detail became my only ally. Every step of the procedure seemed to raise more questions than answers. That was when I came across another discovery, a microscopic substance, hard to detect and even harder to link to a cause of death in an elderly man who apparently had no serious health issues. When analyzed in the lab, that substance confirmed my suspicions. We were not only facing a clinical case, but the possibility of a subtle poisoning carefully planned. But this is where the story becomes even more intense. The toxicology report revealed an uncommon compound, something I had read about in books and reports but rarely seen in daily practice. It was a poison that acts slowly, leaving no immediate visible damage, and that could work in small doses, camouflaging a malady that seemed organic. This fit perfectly with the patient's profile and the absence of signs of violence. That combination of patient, object, and substance made this case impressive and unique in my career. From there, the investigations tightened like a circle. We began searching for possible sources of that poison, and it was in a small local pharmacy that the clue was finally revealed. This man's story was intertwined with the community, with his daily movements, and those who had access to controlled products and substances. This led me to understand that the button and the clothing were more than mere objects. They were symbols of a message someone wanted to leave so the truth could be discovered. A coded message that only someone like us in forensic science could decode. But the most surprising part was yet to come, the final twist that gave precision to all the effort. We found that the deceased had been handling important documents related to investments, properties, and disputed inheritances. His death, therefore, had not only a medical or scientific context, but also a legal and economic background involving people close to him. The button with the code was a kind of key to open that hidden world. Indeed, someone wanted the truth to be discovered, but without saying it outright. Science, with patience and rigor, was the only thing capable of untangling that skein. That experience left me with a profound lesson. Never underestimate the power of details, not even the smallest and seemingly insignificant ones. In forensic medicine, every object, every position, every feature has a meaning. Finding the thread that holds the whole story together is our task, but also our responsibility. Because science is not just about explaining death, but also about giving voice to those who can no longer speak. This case, in particular, made me value more than ever the power of observation and patience, qualities often forgotten under the pressure to resolve quickly. I remember that at the end of that day, as I closed the file and prepared to rest, I had a moment of reflection. I thought about that person who had spent years keeping secrets in the stitching of his coat, in the handwritten letters that seemed to whisper the truth from the past. I realized that forensic science is not just a profession, but a bridge between life and death, between the visible and the hidden, and that we, the forensic experts, are the guardians of that information no one else can have. I had never been so aware that behind a simple body lies a complex web of stories, motivations, and emotions, all waiting to be uncovered. And it is precisely that mix of humanity and technique that makes every case unique and fascinating. Thus, my job is not only to find answers, but also to tell stories that would otherwise be lost forever. This case, without a doubt, was one of those moments when the smallest detail, that minimal appearance, completely changed the course of the investigation and left an indelible mark on me. The connection between the button and that labyrinth of secrets began to take shape more clearly as I gathered more evidence. What at first seemed like a simple signal, a detail accidentally lost on clothing, ended up being a key that opened invisible locks, unmasking a reality that no one had thought to examine closely. I remember that at that moment, I felt how the daily routine of forensic science transformed into a deep, almost obsessive search, where every clue carried the weight of a possible hidden truth. Without haste, but with obsessive attention, I reviewed and analyzed everything over and over again: medical reports, statements, the small details collected at the scene. Every time I went over those elements, the story became more complicated. For example, the place where the deceased was found was not just any space, but the room where he spent long hours with his wife, reading or tending to his plants. It was a place that reflected calm and tranquility, something that contrasted radically with what the investigation was revealing. That apparent serenity was broken by an invisible, almost imperceptible thread that tied that death to other lives, to other interests. And when I talk about interests, I don't only mean emotional ones, but also those linked to economy and power, where greed can be as silent and yet as lethal as a poison. The investigation led me to interview his daughter again, a woman with serious expression, marked by worry and grief. It was in that conversation that I obtained one of the most unexpected twists of the case. She confessed to me that her father had been more isolated in recent months, even distanced from those who cared about him. She said he was worried about certain documents and contracts related to properties that, according to him, were not as legitimate as they seemed. What I initially interpreted as simple concerns typical of any elderly person gradually took on another dimension as I progressed in the investigation. That possible legal and family conflict opened doors to suspicions that the autopsy seemed to confirm. His death was not as natural as we all wanted to believe. It was clear that someone with access to his environment had been able to use that toxic substance to hasten the inevitable, turning a natural process into a deliberate act. The poison we detected at first, that tiny and hard-to-trace substance, was a perfect weapon. Silent, efficient, almost undetectable until discovered by someone with the right expertise. That made me think about the patience and coldness with which the harm was designed, and how trust and affection can be used as shields to hide the worst intentions. As I advanced in the analyses, the questions increased. For example, who had enough knowledge to administer such a toxin? Who knew it could go unnoticed? Was it someone close, someone fully trusted to be near him until the last moment? I then recalled the purchase dates of certain medications and products at the local pharmacy and began cross-checking data with those who had access to them. It was a meticulous and slow study, but every small progress sparked a glimmer of hope to unravel what was behind that so silent death. One night, in a moment of tiredness but also determination, I looked again at that button where it all started. Now I understood that it was more than a simple object. It was a symbol of resistance, a kind of silent legacy that the deceased wanted to leave so that someone patient enough could read between the lines. It was a cryptic message, but clear enough for anyone with the capacity and interest to understand it. Besides a numerical code, I traced barely perceptible marks on the hair tie, the handkerchief, and the book with notes. All form a language, a network of signs that detailed a story going beyond death itself. But then, one of the key moments came when we reviewed Mr. Nim's handwritten agenda again. We found seemingly innocuous notes that, when compared with other documents, revealed a pattern: dates, names, appointments, and above all, clues of secret meetings. There was something more, a safe that had not been mentioned before, whose access and contents were a mystery we had to decipher. That safe, about which until that point we had no clue, became the next target in the investigation. To access it, of course, force or mere desire wasn't enough. We needed the key, the one apparently encoded in the deceased's personal effects, in his notes, and in that button that triggered everything. I knew that if we managed to open it, we would find documents or irrefutable evidence clarifying not only the origin of the poison, but also the motive behind the death. We began coordinating with the judicial authorities to proceed without the news leaking. There was too much at stake, and deep down I felt that increasing tension was inevitable. When we finally managed to open that safe, what we found inside was a heap of legal documents: wills, contracts, receipts, and even handwritten letters, revealing a dispute that had not been publicly disclosed. A dispute related to properties and money, but also to family secrets that could destroy reputations and alliances. It was at that moment when I understood that the man's death was not only a medical matter, but also a political and social tragedy, in which different forces fought to eliminate obstacles at any cost. The weight of all that fell on me with a mix of responsibility and unease. Because now I understood that our job as forensic experts was not only to unravel the biological cause of death, but also to give voice to a truth many wanted to hide. That pressure, which is usually invisible to those who only see the final result, is what sometimes makes our work both fascinating and painful. In the days following this revelation, while we continued the analysis to refine the real cause of death, I remembered that patience was the best ally for cases like this. The investigation seemed to have its own rhythm, slow but steady, without rush and without pause. Each new piece of data was like fitting another piece into a complex puzzle full of edges. That also meant that every person close to the deceased could represent a new clue or an obstacle. For that reason, with strict protocols and caution, I kept interviewing everyone involved, from family to neighbors, including employees and friends. During one of those talks, the atmosphere became especially tense. The man's daughter confirmed that some relationships at home were on thin ice, that trust seemed to have broken long ago, and that certain behaviors of her father had changed in the last months. I couldn't stop thinking about how that button and the personal objects, those minimal details, had been the catalyst to reveal a much darker web, a web that involved not only one person's life, but an entire community marked by silences and tacit agreements. With a mix of emotion and some unease, I had to remind myself that my job was to maintain objectivity, even though the story inevitably threatened to drag me into the emotionality of a human side. In those moments, when everything was reaching a crucial point, one learns that forensic science is, above all, a silent battle between truth and oblivion, between justice and impunity. I knew that every analysis, every report, every word said or written could have impacts that transcended far beyond the cold walls of the laboratory. When the final results arrived, clarity became more tangible. The poison detected had been administered in minimal doses, with the knowledge and intention of going unnoticed by any superficial examination. It had been a deliberate act, carefully and coldly planned in a plot that involved family tensions, legal conflicts, and economic struggles. From that moment on, everything acquired a much darker and more complex shade. That experience reaffirmed something I already knew, but sometimes it's forgotten. Bodies and their objects can be the only witnesses left when death seeks to hide its truth. A poorly sewn button may seem like nonsense to some, but for us, it has a whole world to tell. I learned that the small details, those that the common eye discards, can become the key that opens the door to justice and truth. It was not easy to close the case. In fact, it was one of the most complex I have had to face, both because of the intricate web of clues and the human burden it entailed. But it was also a powerful reminder of why I chose this profession, to give voice to those who can no longer speak, to decipher those stories that life left unfinished, to demonstrate that patience and observation are tools as essential as any technology or analysis. In the end, I sat in my office, tired but with a bittersweet feeling of satisfaction. I thought of that old man, his worn coat, and the button that seemed about to fall off. I interpreted his death not just as a medical event, but as a human narrative of secrets, betrayals, and above all, hopes placed in someone hearing what silence could not tell. Forensic science is, without a doubt, an invisible bridge between beyond and this world, and with each case, I feel closer to understanding that complex connection. I cannot help but share with you, my friend, that in this profession, I learned never to take anything for granted, to look more carefully, to listen to the whisper in the small, and to value patience because, beyond the bodies, there is always a story waiting to be told. And this case, with its button, its poison, and its secrets, is an example that sometimes the truth is there, in the details no one expected, waiting to be discovered with patience, rigor, and a bit of intuition. The most surprising part came when, based on the information contained in that safe, we began to establish connections that had previously seemed impossible. Each document was a piece. Contracts, wills, letters with trembling fingers outlining latent concerns, and coded notes that only someone with patience and dedication could interpret. We started to understand that the old man was not only taking care of his belongings, but also protecting an uncomfortable truth, a truth that could tear down walls and check powerful people, especially those with much to lose. As hours turned into days, each interview, each review recalibrated our perception of what had happened. The daughter, despite her apparent strength, cracked in small fractures when mentioning certain names. faces she had avoided evoking in the initial statements. The neighbors, who initially seemed indifferent, eventually let slip fragments of murmurs, crossed accounts that reinforced the idea of a deeper plot that, until then, had escaped almost everyone. Living on the same block, having shared long afternoons or casual encounters, does not always mean knowing the reality hidden behind closed doors. It was as if a veil, invisible yet forceful, separated us from a truth only those involved could fully understand. One particularly heavy night, while reviewing the deceased's agenda under the dim light of my desk, I discovered a set of nearly erased blue ink notes hidden among seemingly unrelated pages. This finding led me to refocus the investigation on a figure barely mentioned until then, a legal advisor who had accompanied the man in his last months. According to the documents, this person had access to several assets and also prescribed medications, to the point that records showed purchases and transactions that did not fully correspond with the old man's routine. That contradiction set off an alarm in me. Could this person be the key or the loose thread to understanding how the poison was administered? We questioned the daughter again about this figure, and her response was ambiguous. She acknowledged that the advisor had come and gone from the house frequently, with meetings that seemed discreet and tense. She said that once, when she asked her father about those visits, he simply replied that he was dealing with complicated matters and preferred not to talk much about it. That reluctance, coupled with the documentary evidence, began to shape that link as one of the most important to resolve the case. Forensic science gave us clinical data, casts, toxins, symptoms, but the investigation was about those hidden stories, those heavy silences, those seemingly minor pieces that only over time showed their true meaning. With the new clues, we delved into a new analysis. The chain of custody of those drugs, pharmacy records, bank movements, phone calls, and text messages. Everything had to be scrutinized with a magnifying glass, leaving no margin for error. What was curious was the subtle way someone could manipulate circumstances, go unnoticed, exploit the trust placed in them to turn it into a weapon. That's why, when contrasting the purchase dates of some medications, we noticed patterns. Some were bought near the advisor's visits, coinciding with specific days when a man seemed less ventilated or more vulnerable. But the pattern wasn't enough. We needed something that directly linked that person to the lethal toxin. That's when my team and I decided to request a deeper analysis of the biological material found on the old man's clothing and personal items. It was not only about looking for traces of the poison, but also any other substance, any residue that could indicate direct contact or handling. I remember the days and nights we spent in the lab, meticulously examining thread by thread, fabric by fabric, trying to extract the slightest fragment that could be the hidden truth behind that silent death. And of course, each result gave us a mix of frustration and hope. During those moments, I understood more than ever the importance of patience. Although the process was exhausting, no line or analysis was random, no detail insignificant. That patience, which can sometimes seem tedious to those outside the process, was our greatest ally for justice to have a real chance. And for me, as a forensic doctor, that was the essence of the work. Understanding that the body speaks even if death tries to silence it, that evidence sometimes hides in the smallest details, and only those who know how to listen can decipher the message. On one of those endless days, something happened that altered the course of the case in an unexpected twist. Among the residues found in the fold of the shirt, near the button where it all began, there appeared a chemical trace that did not belong to the initially analyzed poison. It was an industrial substance, a chemical compound used in processes of certain nearby factories. That new clue opened up a range of possibilities we had not previously considered. Could that be the real source of exposure? Was the old man in contact with it, or had he been intentionally taken to a contaminated place? That revelation took the investigation into another domain, beyond the family sphere, a possible involvement of third parties, economic interests, and a suspicion that began to take firm shape. A few days later, while reviewing security videos again at the entrance to the house and nearby area, we found something explosive. An unidentified person entered the night the old man died, someone known in the environment but who had avoided appearing in the initial interviews. That nobody turned out to be a domestic employee who mysteriously stopped showing up right after the death. Upon being located and confronted with the facts, his nervousness was evident, and although he initially denied knowing details, he slowly revealed compromised fragments of the truth, details that, although fragmentary, matched what was discovered in the analyses. That night, I realized how fragile the veils of silence are when pressure and truth start pushing to come to light. The information we obtained from him allowed us to understand how, almost imperceptibly, someone had managed to get close enough to administer the poison without raising suspicion or leaving traces. The employee spoke of movements in the house, strange nights, the tense relationship between the old man and other family members, and the constant presence of that legal advisor. It was like assembling a puzzle where each small piece fit into a pattern that science was already beginning to confirm. But I also understood, in a disturbing way, how justice often depends not only on scientific evidence, but on human willingness to tell the truth, with fear, yes, but with a desire for justice to be done. However, the complexity of the case was not yet resolved with those revelations. The legal advisor, for example, began to adopt a defensive and calculated stance, vehemently denying any involvement, while his legal team worked to protect him. But thanks to evidence linking his movements to key days, and supported by testimonies and chemical analysis, the judicial investigation started moving against him. It was a delicate battle of experts and lawyers, where our responsibility as forensic scientists was to maintain a solid bridge between hypothesis and truth, leaving no room for superficial conjectures. While that was happening, I kept reviewing every new finding, every additional detail that the investigation yielded. It was a constant reminder that the work does not end by finding the cause of death, but by understanding complete context, the network surrounding that cause, and ensuring our report scope is so rigorous that it leaves no space for doubt or manipulation. Because, in cases like this, the line between justice and impunity depends on that precision and the strength of the evidence we uphold before a judicial system that is sometimes relentless, but also tragically slow. Despite the fatigue and complexity that this process generated, there was something inside me that did not give up. It was an impulse, a kind of vocation, that drove me to keep going, to dig deeper, not to accept half-truths. I learned that death can hide 1,000 masks, but forensic science has the ability to unveil them all, even if it requires time, sleepless hours, and almost obsessive moments. Because behind every body, every frayed button, every fragile clue, there's a story that someone hurts or wants to keep silent. But we, the forensic experts, are the guardians of those hidden and silent truths. Finally, that case left a deep reflection in me, not only because of the technique, not even the victim or the characters, but because those small details led us to open doors nobody expected. Perhaps the most important thing was understanding that patience and attention to detail are not only professional virtues, but acts of resistance and justice. Powerful tools to rescue the dignity and memory of those who, although no longer speak, leave us signs to follow their path. And although the path is often long and full of shadows, every truth found is a light, however faint, that makes our work worthwhile. What seemed like just another case ended up being a profound learning experience, an irrefutable confirmation that death is not the end, but the beginning of a search that can change many lives. And that the objects we leave behind, those buttons, those letters, those invisible marks, are silent testimonies that deserve to be listened to with patience, rigor, and respect. Because in the end, my friend, that is the true essence of forensic science, being the bridge between the silence of death and the justice of the living. And I, with every case, continue learning to see those small details with different eyes, the eyes of someone who knows in them lies the truth everyone deserves to know as the investigation progressed. A feeling of unease began to take hold of me and my team, almost as if we were facing a living puzzle that refused to reveal the complete picture. Every new piece of information, every clue that seemed to solve a question, unexpectedly opened another path filled with shadows and contradictions. I particularly remember one afternoon when the analyses we had requested began to yield disturbing results. Not only did we find microscopic traces of the original poison on the elderly man's clothes and belongings, but also cross-evidence pointing to a second chemical compound, much less expected and uncommon in typical cases. This strange combination raised many questions. Was it a case of double poisoning? Did they want to make sure he wouldn't survive the first attack? That idea made everything more complex than it initially seemed. We then proceeded to carefully review the agenda that had been almost hidden within the pages of old notebooks and documents. with a trembling yet steady handwriting of that man, revealed hidden worries, as well as names and dates that, until then, we had not linked to the events. One of those names belonged to a former partner of the elderly man, a person who had disappeared from the public scene years ago, but who, according to the information we gathered, still had economic interests in the area and moved resources from the shadows. This led us to wonder if someone else was involved, someone with the ability and motivation to operate in secrecy, using networks of influence to manipulate not only objects, but also people and situations. Encounters with the family became increasingly tense. The daughter, who initially seemed so strong, now showed a certain stiffness in her answers and a hidden fear. In one of the interviews, while we laughed nervously trying to lighten the mood, her eyes filled with tears and her words, which at times stumbled awkwardly, revealed fragments of internal conflicts, old resentments, and family secrets that, until then, no one had wanted to admit aloud. Listening to her made me realize that behind every body we examined there is much more than just a case. There are lives with complex stories, invisible wounds, and a reality that weighs heavily and shapes those left in this world. But it was the day I received a transcription of some nearly unnoticed recordings, which we had discreetly obtained from the legal advisor circle, when everything began to fit together in a disconcerting way. Those recordings included fragments of conversations where they alluded, between whispers and broken pieces, to shady agreements, financial pressures, and veiled threats to anyone who might interfere in delicate business affairs. The most disturbing thing was how they spoke about the elderly man, not as a person, but as an asset that had to be controlled, manipulated, and, if necessary, neutralized to protect greater interests. That revelation showed me a side I hadn't known before, the side of an invisible network operating silently yet effectively around that family and their belongings. The pressure on us increased significantly. Every Monday brought new testimonies and documents, some as hard to believe as they were true, while other pieces seemed to be part of maneuvers to distract attention or sow doubt. On one occasion, we came across a contradictory medical report prepared by a trusted doctor to the legal advisor, which claimed that the elderly man suffered from a degenerative disease that justified his slow decline. However, our own toxicological analyses clearly indicated that death had been hastened by those toxic substances we found on his clothes and bodily fluids. Understanding what lay behind these conflicting versions was a titanic challenge, and I realized it was risking not only their reputation, but perhaps much more. As we delved deeper into this labyrinth, we decided to expand the investigation into less traditional areas, including financial movements, electronic correspondence, and exploring the elderly man's social environment. That's how we managed to detect signals that seemed minimal, almost imperceptible, like a deleted message on a mobile device, a bank transfer to an unknown account, a sealed envelope inside a book with traces of chemical substances. Each of these details seemed to indicate that the truth was fragmented and had to be carefully pieced together with patience and strict criteria. It is not easy to maintain such focus when time passes, public interest grows, and those involved pressure for a quick resolution, but we knew that here we couldn't allow shortcuts or hasty judgments. At a critical point in the case, after several months of relentless analysis and review, an unexpected call led us to discover a connection with a small textile workshop located a few kilometers from the elderly man's residence. There, according to confidential information, materials containing the same chemical compounds detected on the clothing were stored, a fact that led us to consider the possibility that the clothes themselves had been contaminated before or after death, perhaps as part of a meticulous plan to mask how the poison had been administered. This hypothesis forced us to request a judicial order to enter the workshop, an operation carried out with the necessary discretion to avoid alerting potential suspects. What we found in that place shook the case's foundation even more. Internal inventories indicated irregular movement of those chemical products and the presence of falsified records to conceal the purchase and distribution of dangerous substances. Additionally, we identified an employee matching the description of a person seen near the house on the day of death, the same person who had avoided exposure during the first interviews. This lead brought us to a Gordian knot. We knew we were facing something beyond a simple poisoning case. We were confronting a complex network of corruption, threats, and betrayals that could endanger not only the affected family, but the entire local community. During those days of investigation, tension between my team and those involved increased. intimidating phone calls to some of our collaborators, judicial pressures to discredit reports, and even some bribery attempts became evident. However, strengthened by the conviction that we were defending not only justice for that man, but also for all who might be victims in the future, we moved forward without hesitation. Every contradiction, every forced silence, and every sign of fear became a clue that, with effort and time, could be turned into conclusive evidence. One of the toughest experiences during this process was realizing how, behind the veil that death tries to spread, there were multiple invisible victims. The daughter, broken by years of emotional manipulation, the domestic employee, caught between loyalty and fear, and even some neighbors who, though fearful, provided key information that ultimately revealed the truth of a community marked by heavy secrets. I then understood the immense value of forensic work when done with humanity, which not only examines bodies, but also delves into context and seeks to understand the dynamics that led to that death. We are not mere technicians. We are interpreters of those voices that silently cry out for justice. It was amidst that whirlwind of facts, analyses, and human dramas that an unexpected element appeared. The elderly man's personal journal, which had been carefully hidden among his most intimate belongings. On those pages, written in the trembling handwriting of someone who knows they may not have much time left, were deep confessions, names, dates, and descriptions that confirmed many of the hypotheses we have been gradually building. But they also showed a man aware of the threats, who had tried to protect his family and principles to the limit of his strength, leaving a legacy for those brave enough to seek the truth without fear. Reading those words was both a devastating blow and a beacon of hope. The truth was there, waiting to be found. I will never forget that night when, after weeks of uninterrupted work, I presented to the team the entire reconstructed panorama with the scientific rigor and sensitivity that characterized me. It was a moment of tension, nerves, but also deep respect for the memory of the man who had entrusted us with his last secret. We knew there was still much to unravel and that justice often walks slowly, but we were certain that, thanks to every small detail, every button, every thread, we had managed to start dissipating the shadow covering his death. That experience left me with an invaluable lesson I want to share with you. In our profession and in life itself, there are no half-truths or superficial viewpoints that can satisfy the thirst for justice. It is necessary to look with patience, attention, humility, and the certainty that behind every case there are human beings with complex stories. Because sometimes the truth no one expected is not in the obvious, but in what is hidden, in what seems trivial at first glance, but is fundamental to understanding the whole. And it is this approach that gives meaning and value to our forensic work, our decisions, and ultimately to justice itself. The case of the elderly man in Medellin not only reinforced my vocation, but taught me that science, though powerful, is only part of the journey. The rest depends on our patience, our humanity, and our respect for the truth. Thus, every frayed button, every crumpled letter, every twisted silence becomes a fundamental piece to reconstruct stories that deserve to be told. That night, when I turned off my desk light and closed the laboratory door, I felt that, perhaps for the first time in a long while, death had ceased to be a mystery to become a clear message, a call to justice that I will continue to hear with all my senses. And now, my friend, that is the legacy I try to share in every story, that no matter how dark death may be, there are always details, small, almost imperceptible, that have the power to reveal it and, with it, heal wounds that seemed irreparable. That night in the laboratory, with the transcription of the recording still fresh in my hands and the old man's personal diary open before me, the feeling that every piece of the puzzle was starting to fit grew stronger. But just when I believed the path to the truth was lighting up, a setback appeared that shook us. Upon reviewing the agenda in the diary again, I noticed a marginal note, almost illegible, mentioning a secret meeting. A date that didn't match any known interview or record. The details seemed trivial, just another scribble, but something inside me told me it wasn't. There were clues buried on that page that would go unnoticed if we didn't examine them closely. Could that meeting be the missing key to closing the cycle of questions that tormented us all? For days, I obsessively followed that new line of investigation, insisting that my team do the same. The direction led us to several contacts, some of them shady. People who hardly seemed part of the old man's close circle, but rather marginal pieces, willing to act under covert orders. In one of the most complicated interviews, an anonymous informant told us how, Months earlier, a significant payment had been made in exchange for silences and diversions regarding certain irregularities within a business conglomerate linked to the family. That evidence, albeit indirect, opened a window onto a much larger and more dangerous web than the simple poisoning case we thought we were investigating. The deeper we delved into that web, the more I felt we were treading on muddy ground. Something involving not only those around the old man, but also internal power structures and corruption in the city. I couldn't help but wonder how many more people were connected to these events, how many voices were silenced, how many lives disturbed by interests that seemed to go beyond mere money. However, what sustained us was a conviction that every truth, no matter how hidden, eventually emerges. That certainty was the beacon guiding our endless nights in the laboratory and days of meticulously planned interrogations. Time passed, and little by little, we gathered solid evidence pointing to a meticulous operation of manipulation and cover-up. The double poisoning that initially confused the forensic experts was now beginning to reveal itself as a premeditated method to ensure the fatal outcome, but also to divert attention toward false culprits. That uncommon chemical mixture was no coincidence. It was a signature, a trademark of the modus operandi of an organized network. Untangling that network was an exhausting process, full of awkward silences, hidden threats, and a constant feeling of being watched, even inside the laboratory itself. Suddenly, a midday phone call shed light on a new angled case. An old acquaintance of the old man, someone who had led a discreet life for years in a nearby town, decided to break the silence. He did so fearfully, with a trembling voice but with the determination to reveal what many feared. The existence of hidden documents, illegal agreements signed by the family with sinister businessmen, and the old man's desperate search to break these violent chains through his own sacrifice. That testimony put us in check, but also backed all the material we had been gathering, adding a human layer to an investigation that until then had seemed cold and distant. From that moment on, there was no turning back. With every new piece of information we received, the case grew denser, but also clearer. That's when an unexpected link between the legal advisor and a local political group came to light. This connection suggested that we were not facing just a family crime, but a conspiracy with much larger implications. Could it be that the old man was silenced to protect hidden interests within the system? Could a poisoning disguised as an accident be the tip of an iceberg moving the pieces of an entire community? These questions push us to redouble our efforts and not overlook any detail, no matter how small, understanding that justice must be relentless and thorough. I particularly remember how, in the middle of that whirlwind, on a rainy morning, I received an anonymous package at my office. Inside were worn photographs showing the old man in discreet meetings with people we believed unrelated to the case, as well as documents detailing money transfers with official stamps that didn't match declared income sources. It was a profound shock, one of those moments when you realize the truth you're pursuing is much more complex and twisted than you imagined. That evidence enabled us to request a search warrant for a building in downtown Medellin, from where much of the operation to divert funds and silence witnesses apparently had been coordinated. The raid was meticulous. We entered with specialized teams and secure computers, phones, and heaps of digital files. Much of the material was encrypted or protected, but thanks to the expertise of our IT experts, we managed to decrypt conversations, emails, and bank records that confirmed the organizational structure behind the murder. We discovered that the old man not only had tried to expose his corruption before dying, but had left clues of his struggle in barely perceptible places, such as hidden messages in his writings and references in everyday objects. It was that detail, a small embroidered symbol on a handkerchief, for example, that opened the final door to solving the case. Telling this part of the investigation forces me to pause and reflect. There were moments when exhaustion and frustration nearly triumphed, when all seemed lost or when impunity seemed to gain ground. But knowing firsthand the suffering of a family trapped in that web made every obstacle worthwhile. It was also empathy toward the old man and the determination to give him a posthumous voice that kept the internal flame alive within our team. We were not just scientists. We were bearers of hope and guardians of truth amidst darkness. And it was in that paradox that I found strength to continue, to look beyond, and find answers where others would see only shadows. As we gathered all the factors, the social network of corruption, chemical analyses, difficult testimonies, and physical evidence. The profiles of those involved emerged more clearly. There was not just one culprit, nor a simple cause. There was a range of responsibilities, an institutional and personal web intertwined to hide the crime, protect flawed systems, and bring down anyone daring to challenge them. But science and patience, in this case as in many others, would ultimately act as the true judges. Every molecule detected, every word heard, and every glance collected over months would be irrefutable when it came time to sound justice. Today, thinking about this case, I remember one last scene that stayed with me. One afternoon, leaving the courthouse after delivering our final report, I noticed the old man's daughter's gaze, tired but with a certain relief only truth can provide. I approached, and without words, her eyes thanked me not only for exposing what others wanted to hide, but for having walked with her on that painful path. In that moment, I understood that beyond laboratories, protocols, and evidence, our work affects real lives and the possibility of healing wounds, even if just a little, even if only in memory. This case made it clear to me that forensic science leaves no room for superficiality, haste, or indifference. That truth, no matter how small and hidden it may seem, resides in the most insignificant details, in what no one expects but always lies there, waiting to be discovered. Because justice is not just a technical goal, but a human act. And so, with every case that passes, with every body examined and every story reconstructed, I reaffirm my commitment to always look carefully, always listen attentively, and always tell with respect and truth the voices that fell silent but still have much to say. What happened next was a succession of days, so exhausting they felt like wasted hours, and nights so long that every minute seemed to stretch like an endless shadow. I especially remember that week when every breakthrough was accompanied by a new obstacle seemingly designed to break our rhythm, to test us to the limit. Yet, it was precisely in those moments that I became most aware of the importance of staying vigilant. I knew that the truth is not handed over on a silver platter, that it hides behind layers of lies, and that it is in this subtle game between the visible and the hidden where professionals must remain unyielding. The digital files recovered from the raid initially seemed like a maze with no way out. The documents were encrypted with impressive security, designed to hide not only transactions, but also coded communications. It was necessary to wait for our team of computer specialists to slowly decipher the codes, patiently accessing fragments of emails, messages between members of the network, and financial reports that, at first, only evidenced the complexity of the operation from an economic standpoint, but gradually revealed the relationships between those involved. What impacted me most was not so much the amount of money moved, which was enormous, but the indifference with which these people spoke about their actions, as if they were moves in a chess game, unaware of the human damage they caused. One of the unexpected turns came when a private conversation recovered from the server clearly showed the active participation of an apparently untouchable public official. That revelation made us understand the real scope of the scheme. Corruption was not a marginal phenomenon, but was deeply rooted in the system. Holding on to that truth cost us sleepless nights and also jeopardized our safety. It was not uncommon to find tapped phones or intercepted emails. Fear was palpable within the team, but there was an unbreakable internal conviction that we could not turn back. Effective justice depended on our ability to bear that burden and remain whole. Meanwhile, during meetings with the elderly man's family, the situation became increasingly emotional. The daughter, who initially appeared distant and cautious, gradually opened a window for us to understand more deeply her father's life, his internal struggle, and his frustration with the confines of a system that seemed impossible to dismantle. They entrusted me with the fact that the elderly man had used his position and knowledge to try to alert authorities about anomalies, to warn them, and to stop the flow of corruption, but those actions put him in the crosshairs of invisible enemies. That information gave us not only context, but the reason for his murder. It was not an isolated crime, but a strategic punishment against anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. Slowly, testimonies that had been hidden for months, out of fear, divided loyalties, or simply complicity, also began to emerge. Many confirmed how the corruption network extended its tentacles far beyond what we could imagine, and some involved seemingly legal contracts used as a facade for illegal operations. Parallel to this, We received evidence that the elderly man had left coded warnings in his diary, messages that only someone able to interpret the symbols could understand. That piece, the last frontier of the story, demanded not only scientific skills, but an intuitive eye to detect what most could not see. There was a moment during the investigation when fatigue and frustration almost broke us. When we felt that every step forward was followed by 2 steps back, we clung to the small victories. The discovery of a symbol embroidered on a handkerchief, which at first glance seemed like a meaningless decoration, became a clue that broke that cycle. It was an emblem connecting the elderly man with a group of anti-corruption activists investigating the same irregularities from another front. That explained a lot. Why the man had been so isolated in the months before his death, who could protect him and who could not, and even what messages he wanted to leave for those who could find the truth. It was a revelatory moment that rejuvenated our spirits and provided a clearer map to move forward with renewed determination. 2 weeks later, thanks to that revelation, we obtained information that allowed us to identify the main actors behind the corruption, and we began to recognize patterns in their financial movements and political connections. The network was extensive, but the evidence left no room for doubt. What seemed like an impossible, tangled web began to show its visible threads, weak in some places, enough to be cut. However, that same strength in the groups involved indicated that acting against them entailed greater risks than expected, not only legal but personal. I received veiled warnings, mysterious calls reminding me that we were touching a sensitive nerve. Despite this, the team never wavered. Beyond fear, there was a silent commitment to defend the truth. I remember very well one night when, after analyzing one last dataset, we realized that one of the key accused had manipulated evidence within the lab itself, a dark pull seeking to divert attention even further. That discovery left us stunned but also firm. The level of corruption had reached us, and it reinforced the need to establish stricter protocols and zealously protect the chain of custody. I learned at that moment that, in forensic science, the greatest threat is not always external criminality, but the betrayal that can come from within. As the judicial process advanced, multiple expert reports, hearings, and testimonies were incorporated, each providing crucial pieces to complete the full picture. I felt that every time we paused, the pressure grew, that the shadow of those trying to hide the truth was closing in. But there were also flashes of hope. Society was beginning to become aware of the case, and that gave us, even if only momentarily, a shield of legitimacy that no power could ignore. It was as if justice, once all its pieces were in motion, was starting to become an unstoppable wave that would come not only to change the fate of that family, but of an entire community marked by resignation. Finally, when the final report was ready, it was clear to me that this case was not only about analyzing a body or discovering a cause of death, but about confronting a system with all its contradictions and miseries. Those months taught me that forensic science is not an isolated practice, but a living tool intertwined with ethics, courage, and bravery. Because truth is not just an abstract concept, but a reality felt in the relieved eyes of a daughter, in the words that break the silence, and in the awakening of a community that, though wounded, begins to demand justice with renewed strength and without fear. When the trial ended and the sentences began to be handed down, we were aware that we had left scars in a resistant system. But there was also hope for transformation. The elderly man's daughter, who had lost much but also gained a voice, said to me a simple, direct phrase that I still keep as a reminder. "Thank you for not allowing my father's death to be just another number in the statistics of impunity." In that moment, I understood that beyond the technical procedures or chemical analyses, our work has the power to restore dignity to those who have been silenced. In those exhausting and often thankless tasks lies the very essence of justice. Today, looking back, every detail, every embroidered symbol, every hidden message, every unexpected interruption along the way, confirms to me that forensic science is not just about finding answers, but about staying awake to what no one expects to find. Because in that space, between the visible and the invisible, lie the keys that allow us not only to understand death, but to honor life and preserve truth. And if I learned anything, it is that when the body falls silent, its objects and circumstances speak loudly, and that patience to listen to them is the first step to unraveling the stories destiny wished to hide. This is why, even today, I continue to approach every case with the same curiosity, respect, and dedication, knowing that behind every body there is a story that deserved to be told, even if no one expected it before. The next phase of the case was, without a doubt, the darkest and at the same time the most revealing. After discovering the complicity of the public official and the symbol embroidered on the handkerchief, a path opened that led us to previously unknown territory. But the progress was neither simple nor linear. Corruption, like a many-headed monster, appeared with each turn of the investigation in new forms and with new layers of protection. Every time it seemed we had hit rock bottom, more secrets, hidden interests, and dangers would appear around us. I clearly remember one early morning when we were examining some of the materials collected at the discovery site in the autopsy room. We had requested a thorough review of every garment, every personal item, every detail that could be relevant. The old man's daughter had told us that her father was meticulous, that he took care of even the smallest aspect of his attire, and this information took on special significance when we began scrutinizing the handkerchief in question. It was not a mere ornament, nor a meaningless decorative symbol, but a code. Pairs of lines and dots, combined with geometric figures, appeared to belong to some kind of encrypted language that we had not encountered in previous documents. The cryptography and semiotic analysis team began playing a crucial role, correlating those symbols with notes written in the old man's diary. It was a mental mousetrap because the clues weren't laid out for just anyone. They were designed for those with patience, knowledge, and above all, a willingness not to give up. With each passing day, we felt we were deciphering pieces of a puzzle that had remained intact for years, locked behind a tangle of fear, corruption, and complicity. It was no coincidence that right in the middle of this stage, the laboratory suffered a break-in. One early morning, we received an alert call. Someone had tried to enter our forensic headquarters. The cameras recorded a hooded individual forcing the back door, but thanks to the security systems and a quick response, they failed to take anything or tamper with evidence. That intrusion was more than a simple act of intimidation. It was a clear message. We were treading on protected ground, and the network was not willing to give up without a fight. That episode not only kept us more alert, but also reinforced the idea that behind the murder was a group of people with resources, no scruples, and the capacity to cause great harm. In a conversation I had with one of the investigators, he said something that struck even deeper my mind. What you're after is not just a crime. It's a war for the truth. And the war was felt in every analysis, in every confidence we broke, in every wall we tore down. Among those walls appeared the figure of an unexpected witness, a former official, someone who had worked in the same public entity where the old man had denounced irregularities. At first, he was distrustful, withdrawn, aware of the danger involved in speaking out. But after several conversations, where trust gradually grew, he agreed to give us internal documents, emails, and recordings that showed not only widespread corruption, but also attempts to silence and sabotage those who tried to report it. These materials underscored the clear impact of the case. It was not just about an old man who had investigated corruption on his own, but that criminal network had strongly pressured to erase evidence and silence key voices. However, what gave the plot an unexpected twist was a finding in the forensic analysis itself. Upon detailed examination of the old man's body, a specialized toxin team detected the presence of an uncommon chemical compound, difficult to identify and not appearing in initial tests. It was neither a common poison nor a usual lethal agent, but a substance that acts slowly, almost imperceptibly, wearing down the body and causing what looked like a natural death to the untrained eye. That information changed everything. From that moment on, the death ceased to be a mere consequence of natural causes to become a carefully planned homicide. The reality was even more unsettling. To someone unfamiliar with the forensic environment, it might seem absurd to think that such a compound could escape general notice, but in highly sophisticated cover-up cases, these chemical weapons are like aces up the sleeve. The poison left no visible traces, caused no typical trauma or inflammation, and only thanks to forensic teams' meticulousness and advanced technology were we able to detect it. It was a heavy blow to the corrupt network because it demonstrated that their methods were not limited to financial manipulations or threats, but that they had also employed lethal tactics, invisible to many, to silence those who represented a threat. For us, the challenge became twofold: understanding how the substance had been administered and, above all, who had access to it. The context forced us to scrutinize the entire circle of friends, family members, caregivers, and even medical staff who had been near the old man in the days before his death. Every contact became a question, a possible link in the chain of the murder. This is how testimonies emerged that at first seemed disconnected, but over time formed a network pointing toward unexpected people. Among those voices, there was a domestic worker who had worked with the family for years. At first, her statement was evasive and confused, probably out of fear or divided loyalty. But after some sessions, her version began to clarify and contradict the accounts of what had happened at the house. She noted the presence of strange visitors on unusual days and times, people who had requested private talks with the old man, and mentioned minor details of conversations that, to her, seemed insignificant at the time but now took on crucial meaning. The most surprising was when she mentioned something about the old man's clothing. Before his death, he had made subtle changes in how he wore certain garments. That comment, seemingly trivial at first glance, led us back to the embroidered symbol on the handkerchief. We realized it was not just an emblem, but an intentional marker, a coded message for those who could recognize it, for those willing to delve deeper. Essentially, the old man had tried to leave hidden clues in small details, no longer just in words, but in his own attire. That level of intelligence to communicate a posthumous message moved us all and increased the pressure to solve the case. At the same time, the investigation shed light on the behavioral patterns of those involved in the corrupt network. Bank transfers to opaque destinations were discovered, payments for non-existent services, and contracts with clauses designed to hide illegal flows. But what was most unsettling was the apparent ease with which some institutions cooperated to make those operations invisible. There were cases in which crucial documents disappeared, reports were altered, and key officials were unreachable. This made us even more cautious, reinforcing each security measure around evidence and delegating tasks to highly trustworthy personnel. Despite all this, amid that tangle of threats and silences, the figure of the team working on the investigation began to stand out. Moments of extreme tension contrasted with instances of solidarity and camaraderie, because only through unity and trust were we able to endure. The sleepless nights became spaces for supporting each other, for sharing experiences not only as scientists, but also as human beings facing the way of a truth uncomfortable for many. In those reflections, we understood the magnitude of our work. It was not just about analyzing a body or presenting evidence, but about upholding the courage of justice in a setting where the shadow of power tried to eclipse every glimmer of clarity. One early morning, after a meeting with prosecutors and lawyers, I recalled how vulnerable justice felt when unsupported by social pressure. The work of the forensic team, though indispensable, could not afford us the luxury of indifference. It was necessary for the community to be aware, for media to report without bias, and for every judicial progress to become a call for other brave voices to rise against corruption and impunity. In this regard, the case, although dark and painful, was also a beacon that illuminated paths that seemed lost. Now, as I write these lines, I feel that this case was a turning point in my career and in my perception of forensic work. It taught me that every body, every object, and every detail carries an invisible language to most, but evident to those who know how to listen. That patience is not merely waiting, but keeping attention alive, examining without haste, understanding with subtlety. That the smallest clues can trigger revelations that change the course of an investigation, and, ultimately, a life. But I also learned that the truth always comes at a cost, not only for those who discover it, but for those who dare to live it, and that sometimes the struggle does not end with a verdict in a court, but continues in collective memory, in the constant vigilance to ensure those sacrifices are neither forgotten nor repeated. After all, justice, like forensic science, is a path we mark with firm steps, aware that every decision, every discovery, can be the thread that unravels the most tangled web and the key to opening doors that seem eternally closed. Thus, looking back, I cannot help but feel that the body without visible injuries, accompanied by a handkerchief with a simple symbol, showed us that death in this case was only the surface of a much deeper and more complex story. That in the silence of the body were echoes of resistance, struggle, and an eternal desire for the truth to prevail, even though no one, not even us, had expected that story when we began this investigation. And while justice continues its course, I know that in every new case, I will look more closely at every little detail, because I know that's where the voices waiting to be heard and the stories waiting to be told may lie, even though no one had expected them before. As we delved deeper into the analysis of the handkerchief, that small piece of fabric revealed more secrets than we had ever imagined. The key lay in the repetition and combination of its symbols, a language as discreet as it was sophisticated, a code built on geometric figures designed to be almost invisible to those who did not know how to read them. It was not the work of a mere ornament or an aesthetic whim, but a system of encrypted communication. The old man had managed, without digital tools, to create a sort of hidden map, a miniature manual disguised in his clothing. This discovery led us to start endless nights deciphering every stroke, every combination, in search of a pattern, a direction, or a warning. What happened then was a turning point. Among the multiple revelations, a series of coordinates and dates linked to certain events that had gone unnoticed by the authorities and the general public stood out. It turned out that the old man had been documenting not only corruption, but also specific places where clandestine meetings took place, moments during which illegal agreements were forged. Each symbol, each figure, was a key to accessing information that, if discovered, could topple structures that seemed untouchable. It was then that we understood the real magnitude of the danger we had unwittingly unleashed. That same week, one of the youngest members of the team called me on the phone with a voice that mixed excitement and concern. He had managed to put into context the dates and places noted on the handkerchief with audio clips extracted from the recordings given to us by the former official. We even managed to obtain identifications of new characters linked to the network who until that moment had remained in the shadows. Among them appeared the name of an influential businessman, famous not only for his economic power, but for his close relationship with some public officials who, until then, seemed untouchable. The investigation was opening doors that had remained closed thanks to silent complicity. Each finding brought us closer to the truth, but also increased the risk. That growing tension was especially felt one night when, reviewing the file, we noticed that some crucial documents had undergone digital alterations. It was evident that someone at very high levels had tried to erase traces of charges and compromising meetings, using internal systems of the judicial entity itself to interfere with the investigation. It was the first clear sign that we were not just dealing with common criminals, but with a perfectly organized power apparatus protecting its interests. A feeling of vulnerability then settled over the entire team, because we no longer had to worry only about the evidence, but also about our physical and professional safety. Amid this almost oppressive environment, something emerged that we had never experienced in other cases, a kind of trust ritual among us. We became a family, sharing not only documents and analysis, but also fears and personal reflections. We found strength in our nightly talks that kept us standing. I myself felt that every step toward the truth was an internal battle against uncertainty and exhaustion, a test of endurance where patience and commitment were the only possible armor. It was then that I understood that justice, like any other human struggle, demands more than data and evidence. It requires conviction and courage. On an especially cold early morning, we received an unsettling notice. The domestic worker who had witnessed suspicious movements and visits finally decided to fully cooperate. Her testimony, detailed and emotional, allowed us to connect pieces that until then seemed unrelated fragments. She revealed details about times when the old man was visited by people with hidden agendas, some linked to the same office where the former official supporting us worked. For example, she recounted how, on certain occasions, the old man's clothing changed abruptly, as if he wanted to send messages with his choices of attire, an unusual behavior no one had previously noticed. Her insistence that those small changes had intention and meaning made us reevaluate every aspect of the case from a new perspective. The intrigue increased when we managed to identify one of those visitors, a man who posed as a relative but was actually an undercover agent in the corrupt network. This revelation showed us how far contamination and manipulation reached, not only toward the victim, but also toward those who tried to get close to the truth. The old man's survival became increasingly fragile and complex, and what seemed like a case confined to an isolated act of violence was now unfolding as the tip of an iceberg of corruption so deep that it threatened to destabilize an entire system. The toxicological analysis we had performed took on another dimension with this new discovery. Understanding how the substance was administered was a puzzle that involved knowing every movement the old man made during his final days. Fortunately, thanks to cross-reference statements and information obtained through electronic devices, we were able to reconstruct a detailed timeline. We realized that someone close had direct access to his food and medicine, and that on at least 2 occasions evidence of chemical contamination was found in containers used for his meals. This implied the involvement of people he trusted, a brutal blow to perception of security and affection surrounding the old man. Thus, the search of the culprit led us to interrogate not only the domestic worker, but also caregivers who had been by his side in recent days, friends, and even family members. Each interview was an introduction to a network of contradictions and half-truths reflecting the climate of fear and mistrust generated by the pressure of the corrupt network. At one point, a close relative denied any involvement, but when confronted with evidence, alarming inconsistencies in his account emerged. The shadow of betrayal grew ever more evident, and death at the hands of someone within the inner circle seemed increasingly likely. As we progressed, we understood that the old man's murder had a clear objective, not only to eliminate a threat, but also to send a warning message to those who dared challenge that corrupt system. Yet, that message ended up being the catalyst for its downfall. The old man's silent courage, his method of communicating through symbols and codes a web of corruption and abuses, will become the irrefutable proof we needed to break that cycle. His death, though tragic, became the trigger for a chain of investigations and legal proceedings that began to move forward thanks to the compelling evidence we had gathered. But the path was not easy. On multiple occasions, we faced legal attacks, attempts to discredit our work, and pressures to close the case without firm conclusions. The struggle shifted from the laboratory and autopsy room to the judicial offices, where the tightrope between truth and power grew taut. Still, we gained unexpected allies, committed journalists who began disseminating parts of the investigation, social organizations that pressured to keep the case alive, and a community increasingly attentive and supportive. That alliance strengthened the cause and gave us encouragement to continue, demonstrating that in adversity, unity and transparency can open impossible cracks. Looking back, I remember how every discovery, no matter how small, took on a transcendent weight in the pursuit of justice. The handkerchief, that insignificant detail to many, became a symbol of resistance and hope. The codes it concealed, the invisible toxic substance that forced us to look beyond the surface, the secret doors opened by the testimony of those who dared to speak, all came together in a narrative that exceeded any initial expectation. This experience taught me and all of us as a team that forensic science is much more than numbers, evidence, and analysis. It is a tool to give voice to those who can no longer speak, to illuminate hidden realities, and to be a fundamental pillar in building a fairer society. As I conclude this part of the process, still aware of the magnitude of the challenge involved in confronting structural corruption, I feel that the truly valuable thing was the certainty of having walked alongside the truth. Not just any truth, but the one that, through scientific rigor and human integrity, could emerge from silence and fear to achieve justice. This case reminded me that although the road may be tortuous and the shadows many, the light of truth always finds a way to shine, and that this task, though not easy, is a debt we owe to every person who, like that brave old man, leaves clues so that good and justice may prevail, even when no one expected them. The strangest and hardest thing to assimilate came after we managed to secure the chain of custody of the objects found at the scene and the documents related to the handkerchief. Among them appeared a handwritten letter that, at first glance, seemed like a simple personal message, but was actually full of double meanings and veiled warnings. Upon closer analysis and cross-referencing with the information we already had, we discovered that the old man had foreseen that something like this could happen, that pursuing the truth would put not only his life at risk, but also those around him. It was an unusual act of courage, a silent testimony sent to the future, to the hope he placed in our ability to unmask and confront corruption. Little by little, each night became a constant vigil, not so much because of fatigue, but because of the tangible fear that had begun to seep into the team. I clearly remember that early morning when, after a quick exchange of encrypted messages with secure contact, we received an anonymous package. Inside was the original handkerchief, accompanied by an envelope containing a blurry photo and a note. Not all secrets want to come to light. The sensation was terrifying, a mix of threat and challenge that made it clear we were not just watching but being watched. That night, nothing was the same again, and we understood the true scope of our work. Amid that growing tension, another unexpected twist arose. During a confidential meeting with the prosecutor in charge of the case, we were informed that the corrupt network was trying to infiltrate agents within the judicial system itself to manipulate the progress of the investigation. What had before seemed a hypothesis now became a tangible and close threat. We began to suspect that some of the leaks that had occurred did not come solely from external sources, but also from within, which further complicated our effort to protect the integrity of the evidence and the judicial process. Every advance became a battle against an invisible army that never rested, but we could not allow fear to paralyze us. We decided to secure our communication, carefully selecting whom we trusted and trying to strengthen all channels to make manipulation impossible. It was a long and exhausting process, but it also strengthened the bond between us. That dynamic solidified the idea that beyond being forensic science professionals, we were guardians of a legacy the old man had left with greater purpose, for justice to transcend its silent injustice. We found ourselves at a point of no return, where every detail, every deciphered symbol, and every compiled testimony evoked the memory of someone who refused to remain silent. As the interrogations progressed, testimonies emerged that moved us deeply. People who had until then remained in the shadows decided to break the fear. Painful accounts confirmed that the network had operated under a mantle of fear, blackmail, and manipulation for years. But they also revealed strategies used to silence those who dared to denounce or suspect. It was especially disheartening to know that this very apparatus had reached levels where it seemed impossible to separate legal from illegal, right from corrupt. Despite this, those voices began to build a collective truth impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, in the days following each new information leak, media pressure and social expectations increased. It was evident that, although there was an attempt to stop the investigation from the shadows, society was attentive and hungry for answers. Journalists sought us out, and although we handled the information cautiously to protect the investigation, we knew this attention was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it generated some protection by putting public scrutiny on the case. On the other, it exposed the team and forced us to be even more diligent not to make mistakes that could be exploited against us. Every step forward meant simultaneously raising a sense of vulnerability and strength. On one of those long nights, when exhaustion seemed insurmountable, I had a conversation I will never forget with one of my youngest colleagues. He told me something that resonated deeply. "Doctor, it's not just about finding a culprit, but about honoring that man who made sure we knew the truth, no matter the consequences." At that moment, I felt that all the wear, the pressure, and the fear had a purpose much greater than a mere judicial outcome. It was a commitment to a human story, to the brave testimony of someone who chose to fight an unrelenting system from the most invisible place. That idea gave me strength to keep going, even when it seemed the darkness surrounded us completely. The final days before submitting the report were marked by difficult decisions and deep reflections. We knew not everything would be resolved with the delivery of evidence, that the struggle had just begun. We had implicated powerful figures, exposed complex networks, and laid bare a truth uncomfortable for many. But we also knew that thanks to the joint effort of all, the network was beginning to be dismantled. That handkerchief, that simple garment that seemed insignificant, had been the thread that led us into a web of secrets and a call for justice that now was impossible to ignore. As I closed that chapter, while looking at the handkerchief one last time before it was archived, I felt a mixture of sadness and hope. Sadness because the old man couldn't see how his courage sparked a wave of changes. Hope because his legacy remained alive, not only in evidence or testimonies, but in the conviction of a team that learned to resist and persist. At that moment, I fully understood that the work of the forensic doctor goes beyond determining causes of death. It is a constant dedication so that the truth finds its way, even when no one expects it, even when it seems impossible, because in the silence a forgotten object may hide the strength capable of shaking an entire society and igniting the flame of justice.